Now for today's program. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator in Republican and Democratic administrations. Aaron is a frequent commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and BBC, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Foreign Affairs. Aaron is an advisory board member for Moment's own Moment Institute Middle East Fellows Program. Joining Aaron today is Nadine Epstein, editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine and founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Please welcome Aaron David Miller and Nadine Epstein.
Thank you, Suzanne. Hi, Aaron.
Hello, Nadine, and thanks so much, Suzanne.
So there's so much happening in the Middle East. Every day there's something new. And I thought we're going to get to those, but first I thought maybe we could look at some of the big sort of sweeping changes of significance that are defining the region going forward.
Yeah. First of all, Nadine, thanks for having me. You're an extraordinary leader of an extraordinary, I'd say magazine, but it's so much more than that now. But thanks for having me. I want to just say one thing about the presidency and presidents. Jonathan Alter wrote that all presidents are blind dates. And the last book I wrote was called The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. I argued we only had three undeniably great presidents, one in the 18th, one in the 19th, and one in the 20th century. And their greatness devolved largely from crisis, which opened the door to presidents that had both the character and the capacity. The three C's are what determine greatness in the presidency. Crisis, for sure. Character and capacity, competency. Alter was right, though, and this judgment is for my own self-protection. We may think we know the president-elect, and we have a fair body of empirical data that we can analyze. 4 years as president, and an intervening period in which much was said and done. I need, however, to keep a very open mind on what a second Trump presidency could mean. We're not going to talk domestic here, which I think is the area of my greatest concern and focus. But even with respect to foreign policy, I would urge you, as I'm urging myself every day I get up, focus on the headlines, but also be aware of the trend lines, where this might go in anticipated and unforeseen directions. So with that, Nadine, I'd make just 5 observations on what I call the more or less new lay of the land in the region. Number one, it's been framed by what I can only describe to you as Israel's escalation dominance, the projection of its military power in Gaza, in Lebanon, and the rather extraordinary reality that Iran and Israel have now attacked one another openly and publicly twice. Without going to a multi-front war. You can take something positive away from that, but it worries me greatly. So the question in my mind is these three conflicts, Israel-Hamas and Israel-Palestinian, Israel and Lebanon, and Israel-Iran, these three conflicts are not over. In my judgment, these three conflicts will define much of what we're going to see and experience over the course of the next year and perhaps over the course of the next decade. With respect to that issue of Israel's escalation dominance, I think the question that needs to be asked and flows from the reality that military power is a means to an end. And while one Israeli I know described for me the choice that Israel faces between Athens on one hand and Sparta on the other, I'd be a little less dramatic and pose a question to all of you and to me as well. Can Israel translate its escalation dominance into a series of more secure political security arrangements that will in fact change this region which frankly is largely broken, angry, and dysfunctional, into something better? That's the question. I would sort of hook into what we've seen over the last 14 months. Second, the issue of Iran's nuclear program is now more germane than ever. And whether or not decisions made in Jerusalem and in Washington and in Tehran will lead to the prospects of a negotiation to cap and constrain Iran's now nuclear weapons threshold state into a actual nuclear power, or are we talking, given Iran's vulnerability, about the prospects of serious conflict, not just between Israel and Iran, conflict that would draw the United States in and bring about what the Middle East has never experienced before, which is a multi-front war, not with the projection of forces, but with cyber, with AI, with drones, with sophisticated missiles and technologies. That's the second sort of frame. Third, as the Middle East sort of breaks down, at least you've got 5 Arab states: Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Iraq in various phases of dysfunction. The one area of the Middle East, and this is my third framing point, that is not dysfunctional, it survived the Arab Spring barely tarnished. It is a place where hydrocarbons and oil, where emirs and kings and crown princes entice and have enticed American presidents before. It's a place where the president-elect managed to capitalize on regional trends to broker the Abraham Accords. And it is a place that is both vulnerable to Iranian machinations and superior military power. And it's a place where the bulk of American forces deployed in the region now exist. That, in my judgment, if I were to identify one trend or one region where the incoming administration will choose to focus its efforts, the Gulf's the thing. It's stable, it's rich, it's strategically important with respect to hydrocarbons, and it is already witnessed. There's past his prologue here. It's already witnessed a president-elect and whose son-in-law managed to broker a set of impressive diplomatic achievements. Finally, a word on Syria. I'd frame Syria this way, and none of us are in a position to make predictions. We see the headlines. Where the trend lines are going in Syria is unclear, but I give you something to think about. And I use the term the Syrian exception. Will Syria be the exception to a trend in which, in the wake of the overthrow of Arab authoritarians, whether it's Mubarak in Egypt, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Gaddafi in Libya, Abdul Saleh in Yemen, and now Assad in Syria, in every instance, the overthrow of that authoritarian has either led to more repression and more authoritarian behavior, or alternatively, dysfunction. Syria,
Well,
Libya, and Yemen. So again, I think the sign so far with respect to Ahmad Shara, Nam de Guerre, which he no longer uses, Abu Muhammad Abu Jalani, are relatively positive. But again, the question there is, can a Islamist movement with authoritarian tendencies that has detethered itself from its al-Qaeda roots govern a country of 23 million people, a country that is multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, and who has minority groups which are tied to external powers, including, I might add, the United States?
well, let's take a look. This is great to have these kind of wide sweeping changes to keep in mind as we talk. Let's talk about Trump. How is he perceived by leaders in the Middle East? And really beyond that perception, from what we know so far, do we have a idea of what today, now, not 4 years ago, 8 years ago, what's his likely view of foreign policy in the region?
Yeah.
And the perception and what he's thinking may be very different.
Where you stand has a lot to do with where you sit, and the Middle East has 4 years of experience with Donald Trump. If you're an Arab authoritarian, if you're a Qatari, a Saudi, an Emirati, then it seems to me you would welcome the president-elect, because they deal with personalities. They consider themselves figures larger than life to begin with, and they find in fact, they would prefer dealing with a single individual rather than the fractious nature of the American political system, namely Congress, and the various communities that lobby for one policy or another. So if you're Mohammed bin Salman, aka MBS, who will likely rule Saudi Arabia for 50 years should he become king, if you see and look at Trump 1.0 as a positive experience, and it seems you must. I mean, after all, the president of the United States' first foreign foray, first stop outside of the United States, usually American presidents go to Canada, Mexico, Britain. Trump goes to Saudi Arabia, and it's no coincidence. They know how to deal with him. They flatter, they offer any number of business opportunities, which the Trump organization is currently taking advantage of. So I think the Saudis and the Emiratis will look at Trump by and large with some unpredictability, but basically a return to an administration that will ignore human rights, which has a set of business interests which guarantee relatively good relationships. There'll be no human rights agenda, no Khashoggi ban, and Trump may find a way to overlook MBS's relationships with both President Xi and Vladimir Putin. So if you're the Saudis, I think you're looking at this and you're thinking, Joe Biden at the end of the term did a lot for us. They promised a mutual defense pact, which we haven't signed with any country since the revision of the U.S.-Japan Treaty in 1960. They were toying with the possibility of allowing us, the Saudis, to control our own fuel cycle. If Iranians can enrich uranium, we want to as well. We're prepared to sell us any number of military equipment and weapon systems. So I think MBS looks at Donald Trump and says, this package could only get plussed up. Moving to different arees. Let's look at Benjamin.
I was going to say,
Go ahead.
let's look at Hamas for a second. So why don't we so first of all, who is the current Hamas leadership, and what do you think? Are they worried about Trump? Do you think they're going to be reacting differently to Trump? What about that?
I mean, the current leadership, I think if my friend Bill Burns were answering that question, I'm not sure they could come up with the kind of precision, even with all of their intelligence resources. The best we know is that Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya's brother, is responsible for key and core decisions relating to ceasefire negotiations and dealing with the hostages. It may well be that killing Yahya Sinwar, a priority for the Israelis, may have eliminated the only Palestinian leader who actually knows where these hostages actually are. And we should be under no illusion about this particular issue. One of the reasons these negotiations are currently stalled, although I read a couple hours ago that the Israelis are sending a delegation to Doha for one final attempt to secure a deal on hostages. But of the estimated 96 or 100 hostages, the Israelis estimate that 50 to 60 are still alive. And not all of them are under the control of Hamas's central leadership to the degree that that even exists. Palestine Islamic Jihad controls some. I'm certain, based on the Israeli experience, that there are families that have heads of clan, maybe even criminal elements, who control others. And Hamas has been unable and or unwilling to put together a list of all living hostages. That is probably one of the 2 or 3 most contentious issues in these negotiations. Proof of life.
Well, here we are. It's a few days after the death of Jimmy Carter, who, as you said, achieved a great deal in his term. And there are many people who have been making this parallel between the end of the Carter administration and the beginning of the Reagan administration, and suggesting that the hostages will be released on January 19th, just as the Iranian American hostages in Iran were released right before Reagan's inauguration. And I'm just thinking about what are your thoughts on this possibility?
I mean, I would say I believe in conspiracy theories, particularly in the Middle East. Do I think, let's just play out what your question suggests.
Mhm.
Do I think that Hamas, such as the state that it's in, is delaying releasing hostages until after Trump's inauguration because they believe that if they do this, then the US position on Hamas is somehow going to be fundamentally altered? Or alternatively, the other explanation is the prime minister of Israel willfully, purposefully delaying cutting a deal so that he can either A, give credit to Donald Trump, or B, use Donald Trump, as Israeli prime ministers have used American presidents before, to say to his opposition, look, I had no choice. We have a new president. He's pro-Israel. I need him. We need him in our corner. Do I believe that those calculations are dictating the pace? I think I think they've clearly gone through the heads of both Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu. But I really believe you have what, 15 days, 18 days before the inauguration? Is it possible that you could get a deal? I think it's very unlikely. At best, a limited exchange. And in fact, if Hamas wanted to do something from their sort of perverse way they've looked at Israeli hostages and civilians as pawns in a game, they would, in fact, wait until January 20th and they'd release a dozen hostages, including the 4 Americans who are believed to still be alive. That would be a smart move. That would anger the Israelis. It, to some degree, would vindicate Donald Trump's notion that, you see, I'm the chaos agent. They're scared of me. See what they did? And Hamas would still retain the majority of the hostages, which they are going to use to secure what it is they want, which is an asymmetrical number of Palestinian prisoners. Unlike last November, 105 relatively non-controversial prisoners were released. I'm sorry, 240 for 105 hostages. This time around, they want Palestinians who are serving life sentences for killing Israelis. And they know that without retaining the bulk of the hostages, they're going to have nothing to trade for that and for what they really want, which is the cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of most of Israel's forces from Gaza, which, in my judgment, is a goal that is an objective Benjamin Netanyahu is not prepared. So is there a chance in the next 18 days you can get a limited A limited deal, a limited release? Yes. I think the odds probably favor that this is going beyond January 20.
So what is Trump going to do differently than Biden to end the conflict between Hamas, the war between Hamas and Israel?
Well, first of all, the assumption is, governing is about choosing. The assumption is that this is going to be, this more than anything else, is going to be a priority of the next administration, a priority on which they're willing to spend a lot of currency and capital. The pro argument is that Donald Trump cares about hostages. It's clearly something that would hype his brand. The con of the argument is it probably involves right off the bat, how can I put this? An awkward or unpleasant conversation with the Israeli prime minister. I don't know if Trump wants that to have that conversation early in this administration, because what he really wants is an Israeli-Saudi normalization agreement. And to get that, Gaza is going to have to at least be, the pictures are going to have to change and the hostages are going to be released. Does Trump have a strategy for orchestrating that? I don't know. And as I haven't made this point, but it's worth making now. Trump's successes or failures abroad will be driven by three elements, and I just urge you to keep your eye on them. Number one, Trump's persona in Trump 2.0. How does the president-elect view his role, his options in a second administration? Number two, the quality and competency of the advisors that he's identified. And number three, which is the most important factor, whether or not the world is going to cooperate, whether or not there are real opportunities out there to be pursued. Those are the three factors that will define his foreign policy. And I think, I mean, I could offer my own views, but I think it's frankly pointless, and I don't want to prejudge. I don't want to prejudge it with that sort of precision. I could paint a case for right now to say that this is one lucky president, and serendipity and fortuna are critically important. I'm not sure that had Sadat not made a decision to launch his attack on Israel on October 6th, 1973, there wouldn't have been three disengagement agreements brokered by Henry Kissinger. So how the world deals with, so you've got three conflicts. Number one, Russia-Ukraine, which is, I think, critically important for any number of reasons. Number two, can a deal be cut with Iran on the nuclear issue? Because remember, Trump has two sorts of outcomes he needs to avoid, I think. Number one, that Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, becomes not a weapons threshold state, but a nuclear weapons state on his watch. That's something he cannot abide. And number two, I don't think he wants to find himself in a major conflict which draws the United States in, which is almost certain to involve attacks against American forces and oil assets in Saudi Arabia. So these three conflicts, Russia, Iran, leave North Korea out of it for now, and Israel-Palestine or Israel-Saudi normalization, those are the three areas that he's going to inherit. And I'm telling you, all three of these issues, these conflicts, seem to me to be trending toward de-escalation. So he may actually have some real opportunities. The question then becomes, will he be able to capitalize on them with the team he's put together? And I just make one other point on Trump and Israel. Trump 1.0, I've described publicly as a sugar high. The things that Trump did for Israel between 2016 and 2020 were easy lifts. There was no complexity here. You move the embassy, or you recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. You move the embassy. You grant sovereignty over the Golan Heights to Israel, and you grant a sovereignty over the Western Sahara to the Moroccans in order to grease the skids for part of the Abraham Accords. The things that Trump will be faced with respect to Israel are no longer easy lifts. You've got, Nadine, as you referred to, the issue of hostages in Gaza and Trump's threats, which if he doesn't somehow make good on them, will trip him up, right? You've got the question of annexation,
Yes, let's talk about that.
which could undermine fundamentally any hope of an Israeli-Saudi normalization process. And you have the major migraine headache, which is how do you prevent a multi-front war and keep Iran away from a nuke?
Well, let's pause for a
tough.
second.
Those are tough.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the West Bank, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the West Bank right now. Annexation, or certainly partial annexation, is in the air. And also there's been fighting between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas fighters in Jenin, in the refugee camps in the West Bank. And Hamas is very popular on the street. And in fact, yesterday, Palestinian Authority shut down Al Jazeera, which is quite a big step, because they said it was inciting the strife. So I mean, there's obviously Hamas is quite popular in the West Bank. Could Hamas come out, the victor this time? And what would that mean for Israel?
I think when it comes to trying to sort out what the Palestinian national movement is going to become, how it's going to change in the wake of what's happened over the last 15 months in Gaza, I think is extremely difficult to do. The last 14 months, during the Nakba, 15,000 Palestinians were killed, 700 plus thousands were displaced or forcibly encouraged and pushed out. What's happened to Palestinians in Gaza goes beyond anything that they've experienced in their long conflict-ridden and traumatic past. I mean, even if you don't believe Hamas's the Hamas-controlled Palestinian Ministry of Health, and if you if you use Israeli numbers of anywhere from 17 to 20,000 Hamas fighters, you are still left with thousands upon thousands of Palestinians, most of whom they may be Hamas supporters, but they were not formally or informally part of this organization, and a degree of humanitarian suffering and catastrophe that almost creates a situation in which it's hard to know what the emerging trends of Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian leadership are going to be. You've got an 88-year-old authoritarian, nepotistic, corrupt, presiding over 40% of the West Bank, humiliated on a daily basis by this Israeli policy or that, and I might add, weakened by his own corruption and authoritarian behavior. I mean, who or what is going to emerge to carry the banner of the Palestinian national movement in the wake of what we've seen? Hamas will survive as an insurgency, capable of influencing events in Gaza either through intimidation or through co-optation. There's no alternative Palestinian leadership in Gaza. And right now, even with the let's say, the significant bump of credibility that the PA has gotten as a consequence of what happened in Jenin, which was an open threat, first by stealing vehicles, then by attacking Palestinian Authority police, triggered a response that the Israelis, and for that matter, anyone else, has not seen before with respect to the Palestinian Authority's determination to create a more orderly structure in Jenin. That's not enough to build the credibility of a Palestinian Authority that has neither delivered an end to the Israeli occupation or an improvement in standard of living for Palestinians. I mean, there's talk, of course, among the potential releases of Palestinian prisoners, Marwan Barghouti, who's serving, what, 5 lifetime sentences and an additional 20 years. I don't think that's likely, but it does raise the question, who or what is going to define and step forward to lead a Palestinian national movement, which is, frankly, at probably the weakest point since it was created. Yes, Hamas will increase its influence on the West Bank, not in Gaza, but on the West Bank. But again, you'd have to step back and pose another question, which is why everybody missed October 7th. Obviously, the Israelis. I'd put myself at the top of the list of somebody who follows Palestinian internal developments. No one believed that when the violence came, the terror came, it would somehow come out of Gaza. It was always the third intifada, the explosion of the West Bank. And despite the fact that there has been incessant struggle and conflict and violence over the last 14 months, the West Bank and Jerusalem, which is even more extraordinary, given the fact that Hamas termed this operation the Al-Aqsa flood. Why has the West Bank remained preternaturally calm? Why has Jerusalem? It's a fascinating question. It may point to Israeli saturation and penetration with respect to intelligence. It may speak to the issue of simple fear on the part of Palestinians with respect to Israeli government policies, particularly the policies of Mr. Ben-Gvir and Mr. Smotrich. And let's be clear, yeah, the Israelis could annex the West Bank. It would take a government decision backed up by a Knesset legislation. But you have right now annexation in almost everything but name. And that issue, I think, is going to weigh heavily again going forward if Mr. Trump, somehow interested in winning a Nobel Prize for Israeli-Saudi normalization, and I do believe, by the way, that is a core interest of his, you can't do it without going through Gaza and the West Bank. And whether this Israeli government or another would be prepared to meet minimum American demands, unclear.
Well, those are really interesting points. Let's briefly switch over to Lebanon and Syria for just briefly. I'm wondering what you think of Ahmad al-Sharaa, the new Syrian leader, and is there actually a possibility that he could bring that country together and as he's saying, hold elections? And he's also claimed not to want to fight with Israel. Is he a threat to Israel?
Ahmad Sharaa has gone to extraordinary lengths to walk the walk and talk the talk. He's done everything he possibly could, at least over the last 3 weeks, to shelter and protect minorities. I think the Christians of Aleppo were stunned by the fact that there was little intersectarian violence when Aleppo fell after 3 days. He sent olive branches to the Alawi coastal heartland. There has been some sectarian killing. Don't get me wrong, there's no question about it. But based on what I would have thought would be the level of anger, retribution, and vengeance against the Alawis, what, 10, 11% of the country. But as a protected minority, the Assad family, you would have thought that based on the liberation of the prisons alone, that you would have seen massive retaliatory killings, and you have not. He's now met with, well, their delegation, the new Syrian foreign minister, new Syrian head of intelligence, and new Syrian defense minister were in Saudi Arabia. Barbara Leaf led a U.S. delegation to meet with him. The U.S. has removed the $10 million FBI bounty. So I guess the central question, which we can't answer, is can Ahmed Shara control Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? There are elements within that organization who have not shorn the al-Nusra, al-Qaeda label. You've got fighters from the Caucasus and from Idlib that are a part of, I suspect some of them are responsible for doing some of the retaliatory killings. Can Ahmed Shara turn an Islamist movement with authoritarian tendencies? I mean, he ran Idlib. It's no small matter, 4 million people, but it wasn't participatory democracy. The prisons were awful. Alcohol was banned. Can he make that transition? Can he control an Islamist movement with authoritarian tendencies and a movement that's decentralized with fighters who do not ascribe to I don't even know how to describe this. It's not even a gentler form of authoritarianism. It's an Islamist movement. And the question is, can this Islamist movement take into account the role? In fact, someone said today that he'd appointed a woman head of the Syrian Central Bank, which is, for that sort of movement, impressive. So I think that's the question. And then can he figure out a way to deal with the external powers who all have interests to protect? The major one is not Israel. I mean, the Israelis have acted, I think, on the premise better safe than sorry. But they also, whether they're using this as a bargaining chip, they're now in retention of Syrian territory, the Syrian side of Mount Hermon. They're not going anywhere. And we've seen that which is temporary can easily be permanent. Shara has made some very positive noises about no confrontation with the Israelis. But look, whether you're Benjamin Netanyahu, wherever the Israeli prime minister, next Israeli prime minister is going to be, or whether you're President Erdogan of Turkey, you're looking at a country which right now is not controllable, headed by an Islamist movement, which originated, it was a Syrian offshoot of, al-Nusra was the Syrian offshoot of al-Qaeda. So you are going to react very conservatively, very cautiously, which is exactly what the Israelis have done. I think, again, my opinion for what it's worth, I think they've done more than they needed to do. And I'm not entirely sure. Much of it, I think, has to do with their concern, particularly in the wake of October 7th, that any sort of cross-border operation, whether it's latent Hezbollah elements in Syria, whether it's ISIS, whether it's part of HTS, should that happen, that is what I think has prompted initially their very risk-ready policies by moving into the UNDOF buffer zone, which they had not done since the disengagement agreement was brokered by Henry Kissinger in June of 1974. But Turkey is the big dog. And the Turks, I think, want to keep it that way. I think this, in some respects, may have been an accidental coup. I really think that neither Erdogan nor HTS seriously believed on November 27th, when they started this offensive in Aleppo, that it would go so easily, that within 10 days, they would have captured Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and come into Damascus. I mean, it's astounding the ease with which a hollowed out regime and military essentially collapsed. Another issue, Captagon, a methamphetamine produced initially in Germany during the 60s. It's a huge, huge problem. I mean, it's not just a recreational drug of choice or for jihadi fighters who find it easier hyped up to do their killing. Captagon is used by students. It's used by anybody who's got a late shift, has to work night shifts, and it's billions of dollars. And I mean, whether it's akin to the fentanyl epidemic here or not, it's a huge problem. Now, there are reports that HTS in Idlib was into the drug trade. Who knows? That's going to be an important indication. And then, of course, will the U.S. delist HTS, and will they, and under what circumstances, begin to eliminate the economy-crushing sanctions that are now in place?
Well, let's talk about another area of great unrest in the Middle East, at least from Israel's perspective, and that's the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis, it seems like most efforts to contain or to stop Houthi missiles from coming into Israel just really aren't working. What can be done about the Houthis?
Well, the simple answer would be you take the Houthis at their word. I wouldn't, but you end the war in Gaza, there'll be no more missiles in Israel. Now, whether that would solve a problem, a temporary problem, I think the Houthis have managed. I mean, think about it. The Houthis have gone so far beyond Hezbollah, which was, until it was hollowed out, the most well-armed, powerful non-state actor in the world. They've launched short-range ballistic missiles at Israel. The Houthis have not done that. They've launched almost 400 drones and missiles since October 8 at the Israelis. And they've cut they've forced shipping rates, they've diminished Suez Canal tolls. They're exercising power in a way that is remarkable, and they control a fair portion of Yemen. What can be done about them if Gaza continues to go on? The Israelis will probably ramp up their strikes. They've hit Hodeidah, they've hit Sana'a, they've gone after military places, oil depots. None of it's going to work because the Houthis have nothing to lose, and they're 2,000 kilometers, 1,300 miles away. And on this one, geography is destiny. Now, if you solve the Iranian problem, that's the other back door. Gaza is the front door, Iran is the back door. If you solve the Iranian problem by diplomatic agreement, would Iran be able to constrain the Houthis? They're not a proxy for the Houthis. The Houthis have real independence with respect not just to their ideology, but they're also manufacturing with Iranian assistance and Hezbollah assistance much of their arsenal. So I don't think there is a short or long-term definitive solution to the Houthis.
So even solving a problem with Iran doesn't solve that. I mean, let's talk about Iran for a second. I mean, does Iran have the capacity to really rebuild its arsenals now, to rebuild Hezbollah on some level? Um, I mean, to rearm, some of its proxies and allies, or is Iran kind of really weakened at this point?
I think they really are weakened, but I think the Iranians play the long game. And Hezbollah, however diminished its military capacity, still exercises a lot of influence and control as the most dangerous and powerful armed group in Lebanon. All of this talk about Lebanese political reform, and Nabi Berri is going to summon the parliament. Lebanon's going to get a president it hasn't had for 2 years. The country is going to become more functional. I just don't see it. I think the Israeli strategy in Lebanon was to deal with the issue of the South and deal as fundamental a blow to Hezbollah's long-range, high-trajectory weapons as they could. And they managed to do that. But Hezbollah is not dead, and Iran is trying to rebuild. Whether Hezbollah will ever reach the sort of apogee as a non-state actor, again, hard to say. As far as Iran's concerned, my friend Karim Sadripour, who's one of the people I listen to most on Iran, said that the day after the revolution, the most revolutionary leader becomes a conservative. And Karim's right, because you overthrew the government, but now the question is, how do you preserve what you have? And I think that still remains the organizing principle of most everything Iran does. There's going to be a succession at some point. I think the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei would like that transition succession to be done in a period where it doesn't face a mortal or immediate challenge from the United States and from Israel. If you asked me in which direction Iran is going to go, they had a strategic triad for Israel. Hezbollah, hollowed out. Ballistic missiles, not so easily, but defended against by Israel and a European nation or two and the United States. The only leg of this three-legged stool that's still viable is the prospects of weaponizing. And
of nuclear weaponizing?
yes, and I'm not, and then you choose your own timetable. I mean, in a matter of a week, the Iranians can have enough fissile material to manufacture 4 to 6 bombs, but that doesn't mean they have a nuclear weapon. You have to miniaturize the warhead. You have to figure, you need a physics package, you need a delivery system. But that could be done with no interference, probably within a year. So I think that's the choice. And then I was thinking about this the other day. Iran attacked Israel twice. Israel is a nuclear weapons state. When was the last time a non-nuclear weapons state attacked a state with nuclear weapons? So I guess the question is a nuclear weapon really a deterrent? Now, the counter to my argument is, well, don't be silly. The Iranians are irrational. And the reality is they would use nuclear weapons against Israel. So it's not, and Israel is obviously rational and controlled. Iran knew that if they struck Israel twice, the Israelis were not going to respond with a Jericho missile and a nuclear warhead. Does the same logic apply if Iran had a nuclear weapon? I don't have the answer to that question. I know a lot of people who wouldn't even bother dealing with the question, because the answer is these people are lunatics. They're mad humans. They don't care about the country. They don't care about their own lives. They'll basically, it'll be enough to strike Israel with a nuclear weapon for the history books. Okay, can I disprove that contention? No, I can't. Everything we know about the Iranian regime, though, seems to suggest that when they are cowed and when they are threatened, they don't give up, but they also don't escalate. Now, does that logic still pertain now? I don't know the answer.
There are so many more questions that I have, but I want to open up the Q&A for our listeners today. And Suzanne, would you like to come back?
Yes, thank you both for that really important, informative conversation. One question that we've had a few times is what about within Israel and Israeli leadership? Who do you think might lead Israel best in the future, and will that happen anytime soon?
Um, I've argued elsewhere that Israel has a leadership crisis, that the passing of the founders, and the founders came in two sorts of phases. The passing of the founders, I guess emblematic by the death of Shimon Peres, has produced a generation of Israeli leaders who are very smart, incredibly gifted politically, but without the sort of vision and authenticity of the founding generation. Now, I'll mention only three. I know them both. I know the three of them. I've worked with all three of them, and I would never cast aspersions. First on Ehud Barak, who I think at Camp David, the last, in my judgment, not just because I was there, but I think it was the last serious effort to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Barak put some very important positions on the table. So Barak, Ehud Omer, and if you get a chance to see Omer and Nasser Kidwa, they both have produced a peace plan, which is it's worth watching the interaction between the two of them, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, that is what the founders and the sons, almost contemporaries of the founders, those are the politicians that Israel has produced. The Naftali, I shouldn't leave Naftali Bennett out of this either, or even Benny Gantz. None of those leaders, in my judgment, have had the vision and the authenticity and the legitimacy. And that's the kind of leadership that Israel has today. Benjamin Netanyahu is the most skilled politician on the Israeli scene today. Longest governing prime minister in the history of the state, topped Ben-Gurion a couple of years ago. There is no sense between now and 2026 that this government won't go to term. It's passed a budget. Whether it can manage the Haredi conscription bill or not, I don't know. I suspect they will manage it. Maybe Benjamin Netanyahu will be forced to call a new election at some point in response to a crisis or an opportunity. But if you ask me, and again, I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and Rabin and Netanyahu said the same thing to me, almost exactly. Don't preach to us about the way we should behave. You live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. We live on top of a volcano. So nonetheless, do I think Israel has the leader that it deserves at this critical moment? No. Now, neither do the Palestinians. So it's really it's not a one for question. It's a two for question. You need a Mandela and a de Klerk. I'll lay it out there. You need a Sadat and a Begin, a King Hussein and a Rabin, That's the kind of leadership you need, certainly on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side as well. And I see zero evidence. Are there figures in the Israeli political scene that Yair Golan, for example? Sure. But right now they're thought experiments.
Thank you. I'm going to see if I can quickly sneak in two more questions about countries we already spoke about. Somebody wanted to know how come there has not been a coalition of countries fighting against the Houthis who are involved with being the recipients of the blockade. And then somebody else wanted to know, might be wishful thinking, but any chance Syrian authorities will move governance more in a direction of Turkish style or Jordanian style rule than that of Lebanon or Iraq?
Yeah. On the second question, I don't know. My point of departure is an Islamist movement, and you really in Lebanon and neither in Lebanon or Iraq did you have that sort of point of departure. So I don't know which way HTS is going to go, but the way they go is going to be is going to speak volumes about where the way Syria is going. As far as a coalition to fight the Houthis, the Europeans have a maritime force up. The U.S. Navy has engaged in some of the most intense use of their own firepower in decades. But if you want to deal with the Houthis, you're gonna have to deal with Yemen proper. You're gonna have to deploy, and Nasser learned this the hard way in the 60s. 30,000 Egyptian forces into Yemen. It was a disaster. No European government and no American government is going to deploy ground forces to deal with the Houthis. That's why geography is destiny, and that's why the Houthis' lease on life is likely to be longer than anybody wanted or hoped for.
Just as we wrap up, we had you here last year. You were our first guest of 2024. And at that point, everybody was speculating that the war was going to end in the next month or so back in 2024. Here we are now, a year later. Is there an end in sight? Are we talking about another year or multiple years? Or do you think that this war could end soon?
You talk about Israel, Hamas, and
Israel
Gaza.
and Palestine, yeah.
I mean, in a way, the war is over. I mean, I'm not a military strategist, but I'm not sure Israeli activities in Gaza right now are worth the downsides of what's happening. The war is not going to end because Gaza is going to remain a huge problem. I mean, just think about it. There's no international force. There's no Arab boots on the ground. There's no Palestinian force. You have the idea. And if you look at the commercially available overhead, just read Haaretz or the Israel Times, what the Israelis are doing on the ground. Military deployments, broadening the Netzarim corridor, basically eliminating structures. So in the northern portion of the country, there can be no line of sight fire into the Gaza envelope communities. Israel is there for the long term. I didn't say an occupation. I didn't say settlement construction is going to begin. But I don't see any way, based on October 7, that the state of Israel is going to withdraw its forces from Gaza without, I'm not even sure what the without actually means. October 7, traumatic in a way. No other event in Israel's history has been traumatic. And I, I, I think the Israelis will look at Gaza as they're not interested in reconstructing it. They're not interested, this government is not interested in the return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. They do want to maintain relations with Egypt. But again, answer your question, I see no short, even with a limited deal, you're talking about returning 30 of the hostages for an asymmetrical number of Palestinian prisoners. And Hamas keeps the remaining 40 or 50. No, I'm afraid largely for the hostages, their families, and for the long-suffering Palestinian civilians in Gaza that we're not close to the end.
Nadine, you want
Thank you, Aaron.
I know we're done.
There's
I'll
so
try
I
to
know
keep.
I'd like to end on a more optimistic note, but let me thank you. First of all, honored to be talking to you today. This is so helpful, and um, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Nadine. And
Yes,
thanks
thank you.
again.
And thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We'll be sending out a link to today's program, and this will be up on our website by tomorrow morning. And Aaron, we look forward to having you back for another update soon.